wanted to broaden the question a little bit to the whole problem of disappearance, of extraordinary rendition. Obviously, this is something you've grappled with a great deal, both in your life personally, Julian, and Janet, in your work as well. What happens when, in a sense, we've talked about a sacred principle, of course, of common law, habeas corpus, the right to show the body, but what does it mean when there are no bodies to be found, when there's been a systematic denial of the humanity of those that have been detained and imprisoned, when cataclysms have been such that even physical remains are gone? How does one begin to, in your own work or in your own process, begin to work with questions of absence? Not only have people's humanity been denied, but they've been rendered structurally invisible globally, as we've seen over the last eight years of American policy. Any thoughts on that? What do you do when there's, it's not a conventional memorial space where there are remains to be preserved after all. There's something that's not there.
It's a very interesting dilemma for any kind of project. First of all, we need to assume that anything we do has a certain safe distance. That is, we work at a safe distance. No matter how much are we touched by events, still we are at a safe distance. Like Primo Levi said, the victims did not come back to tell the story. And I think it's important to understand that calls for a very serious ethical consideration to anything we do, which in my mind is, how can one refrain a certain, human desire to represent the victims of horror, to attempt to speak for them, as if one would be able to sort of take over the voice of those. I think in memorial spaces, in these kinds of projects, what one needs to try, which is very difficult and is most likely not possible, is to bring the voices of the past to the present, not to speak from the present about the past. And that's one aspect. The second aspect, which I ask myself, the kind of the critical question, and I have some things written because I prefer to be a bit more concise. The one question that we ask ourselves is, how can we make room for the voices of those others to appear in public without attempting to speak for them, not to represent their pain? What about those who can speak, who can bear testimony? What about those who don't have the possibility to appear? So how can we sort of welcome to this project these others that, as Levinas would say, they are an enigma of a face that resists possession and can never be fully known. Those others that address us from deep wells of history and present wells of memory. So that's kind of part of the dilemma of this project. How to refrain oneself from that desire, and how can we, construct new institutions that will bring the voices of others to the present. And which is that's part of the.
That's fascinating, Michael. I mean, your job and the job of your team and your center has been to speak for all of those in courts of law who have been deprived of the capacity to speak. I'm interested in where you see those particular challenges in your work. Not suggesting that the.
We struggled around these issues tremendously. I mean, that Julian's raising.
Yeah.
And partly, when we first started, we said, how do we tell a sympathetic story about our clients? Do we take the poster child clients, or do we take the toughest clients? They both deserve not to be tortured. They both deserve habeas corpus rights. A lot of people, you go for the easier path because you want the one who has the family and is clearly, picked up completely wrong. And you try and tell that story. But you couldn't tell that story he couldn't speak, sitting in Guantanamo. And so that was a big problem. And the second problem was, who do you speak to? Because no one in America really wants to hear the stories, at least in America. I mean, they don't even want to hear about Guantanamo generally on TV or something. They certainly don't want to hear a story of a Muslim guy, the other, as you say, sitting off in Guantanamo. So that is an issue that has run through us from beginning to end. And so what you had out here was, it's ultimately 500 lawyers who we were coordinating, who were speaking really on behalf of their clients. And even then, this was actually the first time Gita was the first person who went there. She saw Mozambique, who's written an excellent book called Enemy Combatant on his experience at Guantanamo. That is one way to get him, someone like that speak. She went to visit him, and then she flew to England afterwards to see his parents. And she wasn't allowed to say anything to his parents about what Mozam had said to her. She's under security clearance and under directives. Everything that's said to you has to be cleared through U.S. censors. Everything. And our lawyers, they don't work in my office when they work on Guantanamo. They work at a secure facility in Washington, D.C. So even when Gita went to see, I want to be careful with it, she went to see a man named Majid Khan, who was actually a U.S. resident. And we believe, I don't know this because Gita can't even tell me, even though I'm her supervisor essentially, whether he was waterboarded or not. I don't know that. But I suspect.
Michael, could you explain for everybody what that technique is?
That's the technique where you strap someone to a board and you put usually a mask over them. They're on a tilt, going with their feet up like that or their feet up like that. You start pouring water into them, and it doesn't give you just the sensation of drowning. You're actually drowning. And then when you're ready to talk, you squeeze something and say, "I'll talk." But it comes. It's actually a guy I know was waterboarded. His name was Henri Alleg. He was waterboarded by the French in the Algerian War. He was the editor of a newspaper called La Repubblica. And he described it, and we got his description. It was smuggled out of the prison in Algeria. And Sartre wrote the introduction to his book called The Question. And he described it as, it's as if death itself took over you, is the way he described waterboarding. I don't want to go into more, but that's what it essentially is. So Gita can't even tell how her clients are tortured. She can tell it to the courts, in classified papers, but not to us. So that's a problem with speaking during this period. When you go to us now, when you go to Gita or me or other lawyers, and the lawyers have sort of become, quote, some people's terms, the sort of heroes of the story, and yeah, it's a great legal chapter in American history. There's no question about that, what the lawyers did. But there's very little on the survivors or the victims, very little. And you're getting books now, you're getting a few things, and I have a friend who was a professor in the West Coast who now wants to set up, all the stuff banning about truth commissions and commissions of inquiry and all this stuff. But he wants to set up just one for victims' testimony around the world. And that's probably the right, at least for our point of view, is the way we're
Around the
thinking
world?
about it. Yes, go to Russia, go to Afghanistan, go to Pakistan, go to, and interview people and get their testimony, et cetera, like that. So that's at least one way in which we've tried to think about absence, but it's been a real struggle, and I think even going forward. Anyway, it's one way we've thought about answering absence, and it's one way we have tried to focus on survivors.